everyone. My name is Jena. I'm the president of Students for Justice in Palestine at Mason, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to our concluding event for Palestine Liberation Week 2024, Gaza and the Struggle in Law, Politics, and Knowledge Production, a panel featuring renowned Palestinian speakers whom we will introduce shortly. This panel was organized by SJP at Mason as an effort to maintain our foundational purpose as SJP, which is to provide education on Palestine by informing the Mason community of the history and the intricacies of the Palestine liberation movement. While actionable items in pressuring university administration has been recently at the forefront of what SJP is all about, education has been, like for any other cause around the world, the root of our organization when we founded just 2 years ago. I, along with my fellow co-founders of our organization, initiated our work with a series of teach-ins to build up the Mason community's foundational knowledge on Palestinian politics with the intent to provide them a strong knowledge base to build up collective campus consciousness, activism, and university-wide campaigns to advocate for Palestine and ensure that it remains at the forefront of discussion every single day. Following October 2023, we began our weekly demonstrations in protest of the university's complicity in the genocide that continues to unfold in Gaza every single day. Between our weekly protests held, we continue to have our political educational teach-ins and activities to promote community engagement and learning. We have now finished up our third week of the student sit-in in front of the university administration's offices to demand divestment and this sit-in was to demand divestment and the cutting of all ties with the Zionist occupation. This January, we continued our second semesterly book club founded on the spirit of our teach-ins, which is that education is at the forefront of our mission. And today, we are delighted to carry on that spirit with our esteemed guests who each bring their expertise in different fields, from humanitarian law to literature to education, in order to have a discussion on Gaza and its key historical narratives and the current political landscape. Now, first up, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Bassam Haddad. Bassam is the founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Department and an associate professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, and a co-editor of A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East. Bassam is also the co-founder and editor of Jadaliyya e-Zine and the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He serves as a founding producer and director of the award-winning documentary film About Baghdad and the director of the acclaimed series Arabs and Terrorism. Bassam serves on the board of the Arab Council for Social Sciences and is the executive producer of Status Audio Magazine and the director of the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative. You want to keep going? There's a lot more I can say about Bassam.
All right. Thank you all for coming. This is a momentous moment for all of us here at George Mason and for SJP, our principal heroes. I'd like everybody to give them a huge, huge round of applause. They have been working against all odds at this campus in ways that are extremely inspiring and in ways that actually have created a kind of atmosphere that makes everyone who is paying attention feel that they are supported, they are protected, they are heard. And I myself, as a member of the faculty here for the past 17 years, actually have been inspired by everything they've been doing. They're doing it properly, they're doing it courageously, they're doing it responsibly, despite all claims to the contrary sometimes. So I would like to thank you, Jena, and everyone at SJP for being our backbone regarding Palestine and Palestinian rights and justice in Palestine. I'd like to open the panel under the title Gaza and the Struggle in Politics, Law, and Knowledge Production. We have with us, basically, without embellishment, we have the who's who of speakers on Palestine in the United States and beyond, in my view, people who have inspired and motivated and empowered thousands and millions of people around the world in their own way, based on their research, based on their fervor, and based on their commitment to justice, not just in Palestine, but justice, period. So thank you all for coming, for those of you who flew in, and those of you who drove, across the pond maybe, or something of the sort. Thank you for giving us your time. I will go right to the discussion. Our panelists will unravel the complexities of Palestine's historical narratives and political landscapes. They will also discuss the importance of decolonizing politics, law, and education, knowledge production to pave the way for Palestinian self-determination and liberation. We will start with the speaker on my right, Jehad Abusalim, and then move to Noura Erakat, and then to Mohammed El-Kurd. So let me introduce Jihad. Every speaker will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes. I'll start making odd noises if you are going beyond, because people are here. Some of you, or many of you perhaps, are fasting, so we are going to break at some point, even though we might actually miss that mark by a few minutes. I am confident that everybody can wait, considering what we're doing here. So apologies for the late start. We were waiting for everybody to come in, and then we will actually have, food. A few minutes after that, we will reconvene for a discussion and Q&A. So this is how it's going to go. Our first speaker is Jehad Abusalim. He's addressing Gaza and the new politics of exclusion. Jihad is executive director of the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center in Washington, D.C. He is completing his PhD in the History and Hebrew and Judaic Studies joint program at New York University. His main area of research is Palestinian and Arab perceptions of the Zionist project and the Jewish question before 1948. Jihad recently edited the book Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire, published by Haymarket Books in 2022. And before you applaud, let me confirm that this event is co-sponsored by the Gaza in Context project, as well as the newly created Faculty for Justice in Palestine at George Mason University. So, yeah. So, without further ado, please help me welcome Jehad Abusalim.
One and three. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I see that the food is coming. Sorry. And that's good news because I'm fasting, so it's good to know that soon we'll have iftar together, those who are fasting and those who are not. So Ramadan Kareem, everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Bassam, with Noura and Mohammed, and the wonderful audience. Okay, the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, with its current geographic shape and demographic composition, along with the conditions within it, whether the unfolding genocide that we are witnessing now or the conditions that existed there before October 7th and October 6th, 2023. This area, the Gaza Strip, emerged in the aftermath of the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe. For Israelis, 1948 marked a year of quote-unquote independence, the founding of their state, and the control of a vast majority, nearly 78%, of British Mandate Palestine. Conversely, For Palestinians, the Nakba signified a profound rupture, politically, economically, socially, culturally, and geographically. Thus, the Nakba represented both the culmination of a process and the start of another. It was the end point of decades of pre-1948 Zionist colonial activity and the starting point of another episode of Zionist colonial activity in historic Palestine, leading to the establishment of a Jewish majority state in Palestine at the expense of the Arab majority population. This was achieved through violence, terrorism, and the support of major colonial and imperialist powers at the time. Regardless of the intentions of Zionist leaders and institutions and militias, and later the nascent State of Israel, the destruction of many facets of Palestinian life, as it was before 1948, was a desired outcome for Zionism and Israel. This outcome, which the Israeli state, supported by various state and non-state actors worldwide, aimed to maintain, sustain, and even replicate and expand. This is crucial to understanding Gaza's current reality. One must grasp the scope of the Nakba, not just as a historical moment, but as a process reflecting the final aims of the Zionist movement and the State of Israel. These aims include the geographic and demographic transformation and re-engineering of Palestine, prioritizing one ethnic and religious group's language, culture, national symbols, historical narrative, and institutions at the expense of another group, one group that is deeply rooted in the land and integral to its past, present, and future, and that is the Palestinians. So without this framing, comprehending the Gaza Strip or the experiences of any Palestinian area or community becomes impossible. The Gaza Strip's emergence in its current area and demographic makeup, when we talk about the 40 kilometers by 6 kilometers, 12 at its widest, was not only a direct result of the Nakba, but also a consequence of its continuation. Today, the conditions in the Gaza Strip can only be understood in this context. The Gaza Strip isn't merely a territory where Palestinians reside. It also embodies a set of conditions, experiences, and challenges generated by the 1948 catastrophe. To illustrate practically, due to the 1948 Nakba, the Gaza subdistrict, the pre-1948 Gaza subdistrict, was reduced from an area of 1,111 square kilometers to today's strip, spanning only 365 square kilometers. Demographically, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from dozens of cities, towns, and villages in and around the Gaza subdistrict were expelled or fled to what became the Gaza Strip post-1948 hostilities. This event entailed more than the displacement of these individuals. It signified the obliteration of their generations' old way of life. These individuals, be they farmers, fishermen, textile workers, or laborers, lost their communities, institutions, shops, trade, homes, orchards, cattle, personal belongings, and bank deposits. Being in Gaza since 1948 as refugees, after such losses, was intended as a temporary situation. After all, war and conquest were not unfamiliar to the people of Palestine. The residents of Gaza were displaced from their city and neighboring villages during the British conquest of Palestine during the First World War. And then after the war, they returned. However, in Gaza, as in other parts of Palestine and neighboring Arab countries, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians faced the harsh reality that their refugee status would become permanent. In the 1950s, Especially in the years immediately following the Nakba, conditions in the Gaza Strip were dire, with people suffering from starvation and disease, and the early refugee camps lacked the basic infrastructure necessary for maintaining life, health, and dignity. In response to this permanence of conditions following the 1948 Nakba, thousands of Palestinian refugees in Gaza and elsewhere attempted to return to their homes, only to be met with Israeli violence, murder, arrest, and torture. Israel labeled these early attempts at return and repatriation as infiltration and responded with severe violence. This response gave rise to a Gazan question that has been deliberated for decades within Israeli policymaking circles. A decades-long dilemma for Israeli leaders and policymakers on how to manage a region created by their actions, conquests, and the gambling with the lives of millions of Palestinians and Jews to establish their Jewish majority state in 1948. From the 1950s onwards, the Nakba persisted in Gaza through the mere existence of the Gaza Strip and its permanence. Israel in the 1950s began to grapple with the fact that the Gaza Strip, like other parts of Palestine that weren't subjugated in 48, wouldn't become a void in which Palestinian national aspirations and claims would disappear. Instead, the Gaza Strip, despite its impoverishment, isolation, and lack of resources, became a stage for the re-emergence of the Palestinian national movement and Palestinian national aspirations after 1948. This put the Gaza Strip at odds with Israel's project for maximal Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. And from the 1950s onwards, Israel began to devise strategies to address this Gaza question. And this included recurring raids and incursions, a bloody occupation in 1956 that lasted for months until it ended in 57 under international pressure, and then a reconquest in 1967 that placed Gaza under direct Israeli military rule for decades. The reoccupation of Gaza in 67 represented a critical moment in deepening the pain caused by the 1948 Nakba. While Israel gradually allowed Palestinians to work in the Israeli market, its policies in the Gaza Strip suppressed expressions of Palestinian political speech, restricted cultural life, and embarked on a colonization project within the Gaza Strip. This project involved taking over land, building settlements, and allowing Jewish settlers to move into the Strip, taking over about 25% of Gaza's territory, 40% of its fertile land, and most of its scarce water resources. So by 2005, 1.4 million Palestinians lived on 75% of the Gaza Strip, while 8,000 Jewish settlers occupied the remaining 25%. The settlements in Gaza made life untenable, creating infrastructures of abuse and control, dividing the Gaza Strip into smaller regions, severed by checkpoints and walls. In this environment, if Gaza was a refugee camp where people's lives were suspended due to the Nakba, Israel interfered there as well to add insult to the injuries of history. But in the face of all of this pain and repression, Gaza rebelled and continued to rebel. And when Gaza rebelled, whether through armed or unarmed means, Israel always responded with confusion and extreme violence. For Israeli leaders and policymakers, Gaza's reality, as it emerged from 1948 onwards, was supposed to become an eternal status quo. They seemed indifferent to the fact that Gaza housed people who are part of a nation with unresolved questions of liberation, independence, and the right to live with dignity and reclaim their rights. Every rebellion in Gaza was met with severe violence in the late 60s, in the 70s, and in the late 1980s, the period known as the First Intifada, and in the early 2000s. And between periods of what Israelis refer to as shake it or quiet, and periods of explosions and violence, This unresolved Gaza question, part of the broader Palestinian question, persisted. Israel's approaches have varied, including violence, restrictions on freedom of movement, isolation, fragmentation, a blockade, and then the mowing the lawn strategy, colonization, closures, incursions, destruction of economic life, assassinations, mass bombardment, and the killing of civilians and destruction of vital institutions. The sophisticated and sadistic Israeli experiment of besieging and occasionally bombing Gaza has woven violence into every aspect of life there for decades. Violence has been a constant in people's daily lives and deaths. Living in Gaza has meant being engulfed by explicit, spectacular violence from bombardment and incursions, as well as more subtle forms of violence that have led people to use the term makhnouk, I'm suffocating, to describe their daily psychological and emotional state under blockade. I'm about to conclude. So explaining these complexities of life in Gaza is a significant challenge, because to those outside of it, and as someone who has written and spoken about Gaza for years, I recognize the difficulty in conveying the details, as most, especially in the West, cannot relate to them. Simple aspects of life, often taken for granted, are sources, or were sources, I'm talking here before this genocide, were sources of daily struggle and anxiety in Gaza. These struggles were exhausting, depressing, and time-consuming, all due to Israel's abuse. Access to clean water, travel for medical treatment or education, electricity, lighting homes, treating sewage, exporting fruits and flowers, importing basic necessities, watching TV, which would be disrupted by drone signal interference, fishing, and harvesting crops. Each aspect is an exhausting ordeal. Violence is in every corner of your life there. Every day in Gaza is another chapter in a story full of pain and dread. Finding work, securing aid, these are continuous struggles. Imagine generations born and raised amidst this dread, this violence that infiltrates every aspect of life, fostering a constant feeling of being on the verge of explosion. One day, the scale, the depth, and cruelty of Israel's experiment might be fully grasped. Until then, atop the years of dread and suffocation, people in Gaza continue to be killed in droves on a daily average of 100, more or less. And this is because Israel's approach to managing the lives of 2 million people through regulated violence has failed, and now they seek to reassert control through extreme violence, mass murder, and genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jihad. We're going to move to the next speaker, Noura, but... Sorry? Sorry?
أنا مهتمة بالعالم بدي إياهم يفطروا.
بس it's 10 minutes.
I'll speak for 10 minutes exactly.
إذا فطروا هلا بيفطروا. Okay.
So if everyone looks around, you can see on your tables there are dates and bottles of water for everyone. If anyone needs any more water or dates, you can just go to the back. We have more stuff. Iftar should be in about 10 minutes. If you need to pray, some of our officers who are standing in the back can guide you to where you can go pray once it comes to iftar time, and then once we wrap up, the second speaker will be able to conclude. So now,
Well, one second, because I must introduce somebody who is extremely germane and significant to everything we're doing today. I'd like to introduce Jena. Jena is sitting all the way at the end of the table. She is a senior at George Mason University, studying civil, environmental, and infrastructure engineering, and will be pursuing a master's of structural engineering at Mason in the fall of 2024. She co-founded Students for Justice in Palestine. At Mason in 2021 during her sophomore year at GMU following the Unity Intifada uprising in Palestine, and has been the president of the chapter since the fall of 2022 semester. She also took part in initiating the GMU Coalition for Palestine, which is a student-led coalition of 21 organizations with the purpose of demanding political action for Palestine at Mason. Her organizing experience began in 2021 when she joined the local chapter of the Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM, DMB. Since then, she has had significant involvement in local Palestinian organizing, including planning and leading demonstrations and events in DC, and facilitating the connection across local SJP chapters, and co-founding the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia SJP coalition, which now spans across 8 local universities across DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Can we pass this to her? Jena, she's speaking. She's introducing you.
Thank you, Bassam. And I do want to recognize that some people from these 8 local universities are present today. So thank you guys for coming out from Maryland, from DC, and making your appearance.
Sorry, folks, we're trying to make sure that we have a clear audio copy screen, where we have more than 1,200 or 1,400 people.
Anything else? So thank you, Bassam, for that introduction. Next up, I'd like to introduce Noura Erakat. She is a human rights attorney and an assistant professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick Department of Africana Studies. Her research interests include humanitarian law, refugee law, national security law, and critical race theory. Noura is the author of Justice for Some, Law as Politics in the Question of Palestine. She is a co-founding editor of Jadaliyya e-zine and an editorial committee member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. She has served as legal counsel for a congressional subcommittee in the House of Representatives, as a legal advocate for the Badil Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, and as the national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the United States campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Noura is the co-editor of Aborted State, the UN Initiative and New Palestinian Junctures, an anthology related to the 2011 and 2012 Palestinian bid for statehood at the UN. More recently, Noura released a pedagogical state project on the Gaza Strip and Palestine, which includes a short multimedia documentary, Gaza in Context, which is co-sponsoring today, and that rehabilitates Israel's war on Gaza within a settler colonial framework solidarity. She's a frequent commentator with recent appearances on CBS News, CNN, Fox News, and NPR, among many, many others, and her writings have been widely published in the national media and academic journals. Everyone please give a hand to Noura Erakat.
Thank you, Jena. Thank you, Jena. You know, I guess, what time is it? Do I speak?
7:13. We actually
You have 4
to
minutes.
finish this talk before we break, if you don't mind. If we can just wait a few minutes, we would really appreciate it.
I will not mind as people take their water, need to move around. It's all good. Thank you for being here and for welcoming us. I want to point out what we see looking out at you, which is the pillar of our movement today, holding our ground across U.S. universities, universities globally, frankly, who are leading the charge, creating new discourses. You are actually leading us, even though we are in quote-unquote senior positions. I also want to point out another obvious thing that we're seeing from up here, which is that though the panel itself is skewed gender-wise, of man to woman or men to women, the audience is full of women. And our organizers, it's not just that. Our organizers and our organizations and our movements are predominantly led by women today, as they were in my generation, as surely they were in previous generations, though our leaderships don't adequately represent that. So I want to encourage all of you sitting here, and I see you, to step up, to take up space, to be bold, to be impolite, to not be appropriate, in order to take the space that you are rightfully filling on the streets, in your classrooms, on campus, across organizations, so that the representation is actually more accurate in future panels. Okay, so as I start almost all my talks since I've begun this, I'll start with what day it is. And today is day 161 of genocide. It is so far the most long-lasting genocide of our recent history, and certainly in the Palestinian onslaught, systematic onslaughts that Palestinians have endured, that jihad captured for us, is certainly the longest. The closest one to this came in 2014. In 51 days, we are witnessing unprecedented times. And times where words are starting to fail what only our rage mixed with despair and hope can capture. So let me start. I'm asked to talk a little bit about, we want to figure out how is it that we're victorious and that we ensure our victory. And one of the ways that we do that is through the many tactics that we're using, whether it be through politics, the academy, knowledge production, literature, or the law, as which I study as well as practice, is to share with you how is it that we have a particular antagonism to the law today as we've seen it fail. If all of these laws, especially since 1945, which basically ushers in a different era known as a human rights era, where the individual is a rights-bearing agent under international law who is recognized, not merely are states recognized, but individuals are recognized in the aftermath of the Second World War, where it was seen that the greatest harm to individuals is actually states. And yet international law is constructed in order to protect the rights of states, which creates this contradiction that we're bearing witness to, right? And so, but there's a particular antagonism towards law as we're seeing. Why isn't it doing the very thing that we expect it to do, especially to stem genocide in this moment? I think about this to myself, and one of the ways, the first thing I'll tell you is that our understanding of the law actually put too much expectation on it. Expected it to do something that it didn't actually have the capacity to do. It does far more for states than it does do for individuals, and certainly for stateless people, right? It's why Hannah Arendt will describe that the greatest form of insecurity and vulnerability is the status of being human. Because humans don't have rights, citizens do, who are citizens of states. And the first step of being able to harm humans is to denationalize them, as we saw the Third Reich do to Jews across Europe who happen to have citizenship. But in this moment, let me just periodize where we've been. How do we get to day 161, and a particular amount of disdain for law, whether or not those expectations were justified. So in the first period, I think that most of us following October 7th were mostly in shock, right? As information began to come out that that has since been debunked, but that we didn't even have time to consider, as we were told propaganda point about propaganda point in order to build a racist, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian narrative about the barbaric people who needed to be destroyed by any means necessary. We were all being primed using that discourse in order to accept a large number of Palestinians that we were going to see massacred. We knew that was what was going to happen in this earliest period, and many of us stood out in the front to be able to resist what we saw coming, this train coming, as we were asked repeatedly to condemn ourselves, as we were told repeatedly that this form of armed resistance and violence was barbaric, while all other forms of violence that target civilians, that massacre without discrimination, is basically warfare, right? But the second stage of our experience to this point was the stage of ceasefire. When we get ceasefire, I think it might have been on day 60, in late November, I forget the exact day, 59 or 60 in late November, where we get ceasefire and there's a moment of reprieve. There's hope in this moment that this might actually be over if we can extend the ceasefire a little bit more, which was what was outlined originally in the agreement. It was a moment that we started to talk about prisoners, when we understood that all Palestinians are hostages who have been taken for granted and not seen. And in this moment, we opened up a different discourse altogether about the condition of Palestinians under settler colonialism, apartheid, and constant removal. It was after the crash and the dismantled hope of that ceasefire being sustained that we enter the next stage, which is when the Republic of South Africa, within a month, on December 29th, files an application at the ICJ charging Israel with genocide and the failure to prevent genocide. And this also was a moment of hope, because we were pulling on something that would help us stop these massacres, that would help stop the images that any human looking at them understands is unacceptable. Babies being pulled out with 2 limbs without any family members. That should be enough for us to declare an immediate ceasefire. And yet, because of the barrage and the heaviness of racism, which somehow makes that common sense to other audiences, we did not get that ceasefire, nor do we get accountability. And instead, we see the Republic of South Africa make a pivot towards the most significant judicial organ in the international system, which is a derivative of the United Nations, unlike the International Criminal Court, which is established by treaty, that all of us, myself included, develop hope. Hope, not only that this can end, right? But more than that we will see accountability for Israel's committing of genocide. And notwithstanding a judicial ruling that if we're talking about this, and you can ask me in the Q&A, the judicial ruling actually rejects every single one of Israel's arguments, finds that it's committing a plausible genocide, despite the provisional orders that demand that Israel either conduct its campaign, which ensures humanitarian access, the ability for women to give birth and for babies to survive, that ensures that there will not be indiscriminate killing, that ensures that you will not create the conditions of life that will destroy a people in whole or in part, or it must cease its campaign. Instead, now we're living this era where, despite all those efforts, we see Israel not only not stopping, but becoming more brazen in its genocidal campaign. Not only have they not allowed and created access, humanitarian corridors and access to humanitarian aid, food, medicine, water, hygiene. Now we are seeing them massacre starving Palestinians who are waiting in line for food. 14 massacres now of Palestinians waiting in line for food, starving Palestinians. And so it makes sense that in this moment that we're living, where there's no irony left, you don't need a panel anymore. You don't need a panel to explain to you that this is beyond illegal, this is immoral. This is a stain on all of us. There is no future in which we can live beyond this moment that's a future worthy of our children, that marked a people completely for erasure. This is a battle right now with a full frontal battle against racism and colonialism that has exposed everything that we might have done in our work as academics to expose the contradictions and what might seem counterintuitive is now on full display. We are seeing journalists who can't even do their jobs of basically reporting accurately, but instead repeating talking points that won't even ask proper questions. And so this is why I would imagine this is why there is even a greater disdain for the law in this particular moment than there ever was before for those who believed that it was simply a tool of oppression and a fig leaf for power. And I don't want to take that cynicism away from you. I don't want to take that cynicism away from you. I actually think that law is power. And I think that in order to be used on behalf of emancipatory struggles, it needs to be wielded in the sophisticated service of political movement, because political movements are power. You are power. And just as the law has been disappointing, so has the media that hasn't done its job. So has government, which hasn't represented the people like it's supposed to represent them. 80% of registered Democrats have demanded a ceasefire, and yet a democratic establishment is opposed to it. Academia has not done its job. The bastion of knowledge production, education, which should be providing context, is instead a tool of repression, is creating the precedent targeting Palestinian students and Palestinian allies that will establish a right-wing atmosphere for other movements in the future to come, unwittingly or wittingly, serving a far-right agenda in the way that they come after SJPs. And so this idea that these establishments, these institutions have disappointed us is not just targeting the law, but across the board, it's targeting all of us. But just as we can't give up on all of these avenues, all of these tools that are available to us, we also can't forfeit the law as a tool in this moment. It's only that. We have no fidelity to it. We know that there's genocide against the Palestinian people, not because of a 1948 convention that says so, but because Palestinians have told us so, because we have watched it with our own eyes. We have felt it in our bodies and in our bones. And so how is it that we continue using the law as a tactic without fidelity in this moment? Well, we have several options available to us. One of the first ones at the ICJ, and I'll be very frank, I think that the future stage of proceedings of the ICJ, that at the later stage, so this stage was based on plausibility, the later stage will be a much higher threshold. And I don't necessarily think that the court will find that this is genocide at that stage of proceedings, based on the Serbia versus Bosnia jurisprudence, which created a distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. So that you can ethnically cleanse a people, right? But that's not genocidal, even if it destroys them, because you have to have the intent to destroy them, right? But then why go to the ICJ at all? It's to provide this tool that we've had available to us in order to get a ceasefire. That's why. We knew this as jurists, but you do it anyway to get that ceasefire, and we've seen that mobilization happen. We've seen it as it's shifted the stance of multiple heads of state who have now endorsed ceasefire. We've seen it in the way that the United States and Israel have been further isolated. We've seen it in the way that countries have actually imposed sanctions on weapons transfers from F-35 parts of jets to Japanese companies that are are cutting off their contracts with Israel, to Colombia that's no longer importing aid from Israel, to the Mexico and Chile, which have filed their own petitions against Israel. We see it as a tool that has created both the disincentives and the incentives for other actors to act. Similar with the ICC, which I won't get into because of our shortage of time, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, and similar to the ongoing proceedings in national courts, including in the United States, where we see the Center for Constitutional Rights sue Blinken, Biden, and Austin for complicity in genocide. Frankly, for more than complicity, this is a US war on Palestinians, which is why this has been so difficult to overcome with this in this country, and why we have been gaslit. But finally, even if we can overcome these, and I don't know what I am on time, so that's why I'm hesitant to continue. Should I stop?
You're out of time. But if you also can بس تخفف شوي ايديك كده من the camera.
أنا صراحة لازم كنت واقفة، ما بعرف إنه هيك بتحمس كتير. حق عليكم لازم وقفت. المهم. I do want to just, I'll plant a seed. I don't want to keep you from eating at this point, but I'll plant a seed. And I'm sitting on my hands at this point. When we come back, and probably in the Q&A, to also just, the law is not going to deliver anything to us. not going to deliver anything to us. The way that Israel is reinterpreting humanitarian law and laws of war is basically to justify everything that it's doing. So they don't think that they're violating any of the law. In fact, for example, just one example, in the concept of proportionality, which says that a state belligerent can only use the force necessary in order to achieve its military advantage, so that the civilian harm has to be weighed and balanced against the military advantage achieved, that usually concerns a single operation. Okay, my hands are coming up. That usually concerns a single operation. But Israel is reinterpreting that standard so it's not against one single military operation, but against the whole operation. So now killing 100 civilians in a single strike, which is obviously disproportionate in order to possibly kill a Hamas leader, becomes proportionate in Israel's interpretation if you think about its entire campaign and what it's trying to achieve in the long run. So this is a battleground. The law does not have any values available to us. And similar to that, Israel is also trying to establish an exception on the prohibition of genocide in this instance. I'll leave all of that analytical work for when your stomachs are more full and you are hydrated and when we come back. Thank you.
For that amazing introduction. Now for the food. So the food is in the back, and before everyone gets up, I just want to say, can we prioritize everyone who's been fasting today? So if you haven't been fasting today, you can just stand back for a second. We're going to get about 10 minutes for everyone to pick up their food. You have plates in front of you, so you can just walk on over and form a line. We're going to serve the food for you. It's all halal. It's provided by Bawad, the Mediterranean Grill, which is a Gazan-owned restaurant. And yeah, we'll take about 10 minutes. If you can do your best just to come back to your seats once you eat your meals, that'd be great. Thank you.
And one more thing, very quickly, for those who are watching online, which is now well over 2,000 people watching, if you can take the next 10 to 12 minutes to do whatever you like. We're going to keep the stream going, and we will be back with the Q&A after 12 minutes. Thank you.
After a day.
After we come back, Muhammad will speak, so don't